Hi, and welcome to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with William Hazelgrove, the author of 160 Minutes, The Race to Save the RMS Titanic. He's written nearly 24 books on people like the Wright brothers, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow and Edith Wilson, and Al Capone. Thanks so much for being here, Bill Hazelgrove.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. There probably isn't anyone in America who doesn't know the broad story, at least, of the Titanic. On April 14th, 1912, 4 days into its maiden voyage between the UK and the US, the biggest ship ever made crashed into an iceberg. The 880-foot-long, 175-foot-high ship sank, killing 1,514 victims out of 2,224 people aboard. After all, what can stop the effect of 400 tons of water rushing into the ship per minute? So many documentaries, so many books, and one of the most popular movies ever made focus on the sinking itself. How did it happen? Who lived? Who died? But Bill focuses on the 2 hours and 40 minutes between impact at 11:40 and sinking at 2:20 in the morning that hundreds of people spent trying to get to the ship before it sank. So, Bill, is this a story of failure or of heroism?
Well, the mythology is one of heroism. We live in a time of demythologizing history. A lot of things being torn down, statues being torn down. All my books, I try and get under history, try and give you the real story. Madam President, The Secret Presidency of Edith Wilson was one of my first, where this woman took over the presidency and ran the country for 2 years. So with Titanic, my thought was, I came at the mythology of it, not quite sure what I would find. And of course, the myth is that, the 1%, the Gilded Age class had their shot of brandy, a cigar, and sent off their wives and children into the boats, and then they went down with the ship. The reality is a lot different. First of all, Titanic wasn't alone. We can talk about this some more. Because to have a great tragedy, you must have a fate that is unbreakable, and Titanic's was not. So there's that. And then we have the possibility that everyone could have been saved were it not for human failing. And of course, this is
twice.
Nothing.
You said it twice in the book, one after another. You said two sentences in a row that, right?
Right.
Everyone could have been rescued if not for human failing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was like, when I said that, and it kind of became the tag of the book, there was a 2-page spread in the Daily Telegraph in Britain with that headline. And talk about reactions. I got a lot. And that's just because with all our mythology, there are people who are very invested in it, keeping the history the same. Certainly with Titanic, we're very invested that this great tragedy remain inviolate, and that it remains just this fait accompli, that there was nothing that could be done. The fact of the matter is, everyone, or at least just about everyone, could have been rescued. Again, I'll say it again, if it were not for human failing.
What is the story we've been told? I want to go into that mythology that you described there briefly. This was something I pulled out of the book. The band played Nearer by God to Thee, while the WASP inheritors of male privilege, the titans of their time, the Guggenheims, the Vanderbilts, gloriously threw down the gauntlet for all that was good and decent, and saw off their wives and daughters in lifeboats before having a final cigar, dressed in their finest like gentlemen, and stepped off the last good ship of the Gilded Age and plunged to their icy fate. What a way to describe the myth of what happened on the Titanic.
Yeah, well, it is the great white male mythology. I hate to be trite and say that, but that's really what was handed down to us. Now, one reason we have this mythology is because at this time, hard to believe, Tragedies of this scale were not really known. Daniel Thayer, who was a 17-year-old on board, wrote a book in 1940 where he said, before Titanic, newspaper headlines were all the same size. Life had a symmetry to it. The airplane was just invented. Most people didn't have cars. After Titanic, the carnage of the 20th century came in. And this is very true. So the reason that they have this mythology is because they had to make sense of this tragedy. And so what way to do it better than the Christian white male Judeo ethic, which is basically, this was a great moment for great men to show honor, chivalry, and great sacrifice. And what better than the gods of their time, the robber barons of the Gilded Age, which of course everybody now knows all about the Gilded Age because of the show. And so this was painted in very early that their fate was sealed, and the best they could do was act in this great white male tradition, of course ignoring that there was a bunch of third-class people down in steerage while they were all busy up there taking the boats. And this was the mythology that was handed down to us initially, mostly from the newspapers, who did not have any information. That's the thing you have to realize, is mostly they didn't have enough information, so they made up a lot of stuff. I mean, yellow journalism was still clicking along, and so this sort of story was handed down all the way down to James Cameron's movie in 1997.
I am going to ask about that in 2 seconds, but first I just want to ask, what were your sources for this? You described that there is a book that was written in 1955 by a man named Walter Lord, because he kind of took all the survivor stories and put them into one place. But what other sources are there? And I guess describe that source. And is there an archive of Titanic material somewhere, or do you have to go between the US and UK and pull out these transcripts of oral histories, or just read a bunch of newspapers?
All the above. Going back to Walter Lord's book. So he's a copywriter in New York kicking around, and he decided he wanted to write a book on the Titanic. Well, he had the advantage of people still being alive, so he could interview all of them. And so, his book is only 116 pages. It's very short. There's no footnotes. It's a novel, basically. It's a sort of you are there, voyeuristic journey. And it's not so much that it's wrong, because he did interview these people. It's where he decided to put his camera. But this established the floor for all Titanic histories to follow. If you read any Titanic history, you drill down, at the core of it is Walter Lord's book. So this sort of set the floor, and everybody built on it. That's what historians do. They take one book and they build on another. I come along, and so, just to sort of full disclosure, I don't find, old manuscripts and trunks and things like that. I usually interpret what's in plain sight. So what I did was, of course, I read everything everybody else had written, and then I went to newspaper articles, which is a great resource because the newspaper articles are unfiltered. So if you read a newspaper article dated April 16th, 1912, you're getting what somebody on that ship said to a reporter right before they got off, right before anybody got to them, anybody said anything, history changing. And that's amazing, because then you can start to piece together the real story. Then, of course, there was the investigations, the American, the British, and, of course, those testimony, all that testimony is there. And, of course, everything's been digitized. So, guys who did what I did before, Eric Larson's, and he's still doing it. He's great. They all travel all over the world and go to these places and do really cool things. And, hey, God bless them. They can spend thousands of dollars doing that stuff. But the truth is, in a very unromantic way, you don't have to do that anymore. Everything's digitized. Everything. I mean, Smithsonian, newspapers. I have a site that I go to. I have every single newspaper going back to like 1775. So, I'd like to say that I went digging around in churches and trunks and stuff and went in some attic and found this. Aha, I know the story. It's simply not true. What I do is I bring common sense to it and say, no, that's not the way it happened. Here's here's what makes more sense. And that's how I stitch my stories together.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
What's interesting about Titanic is that this is a case where there is totally, at least at one time, there was totally a finite number of people who could have been on that boat. We know it. There are about 700 people or so. I'm just going to give an example. If you want to talk about witnesses to 9/11, there are literally thousands of people who witnessed the event in different ways, either inside the buildings, outside the buildings, came up upon it afterwards. People who saw it on TV. My parents were up in their apartment in the Bronx looking down to Lower Manhattan. I mean, they're technically witnesses. There are many different angles to view this from. But how did you find that aspect of it? And what's interesting about that there are literally a finite number of people on that boat. And in one way or another, most of them, if not all of them, were all verifiably there or not.
Yeah, so like you said, there was about 700 and some, 75 or so who survived. Were picked up by Carpathia, and so they were all interviewed. A lot of them were interviewed by journalists who wanted that story desperately.
Were they all interviewed? Do we know that? All of them?
Not all of them, just the ones they could get to. And also, they were interviewed by local papers a lot of times. It's not like today where, CNN, boom, it goes and spreads out. A lot of times they were interviewed by Canadian newspapers, British newspapers, small town newspapers. So it's sort of a patchwork quilt. Now, there was some interest in it afterward. There were several early movies and such. So maybe some people were, interviewed for that. Mostly it sort of lies dormant until Lord's book comes along in the 50s. And then interest is sort of kicked back up in it. But, again, because a lot of these newspapers were not digitized, and these articles flashed up and went away, there was no way to sort of pull them together and stitch it together and say, oh, this doesn't jive with what I'm hearing here. And so one great thing about the time we live in is you can pull up obscure interviews that no other scholar or historian or anybody's seen for say 100 years, because they gave the interview, it flashed up and disappeared for all time. But in those, because these are eyewitness accounts, it's primary source material. And for any historian, that's the great thing. What you're after is verisimilitude, which means the closest approximation of what is true. And so with any book I write, you're always trying to get to that. And I think one of the best ways to do it is by these testimonials, because every time you take a book on, say, Titanic or anything else, that author is going to bring his biases and everything into it and tell his story he wants to tell, as I do. So what's great about doing something like saying newspapers, letters, diaries, and I use those, is that's that person who was there giving their impression of what happened. And then you can bring that in, and it gives it veracity. Because what you're doing is, and the way I like to write is, I call it sort of experiential history, where I sort of say, here it is, I'm going to set the scene. And because I started as a novelist, I write in scenes. And so I'm going to give this to you. That's what narrative nonfiction is. It's history in scenes. You're going to experience it, and then you make your decision at the end of the book. Could they all have been saved?
This is an aside, were there people who said, "Oh yeah, I was there. Let me tell you what happened," or tried to pull a scam or something like that and get into a victim's fund or get into the newspapers and exaggerate their claims?
Well, there were, and there's people who, in the people who tried to defend themselves against the later charges, said, "Oh, this person was paid for this, or this person was paid for that." The way you get around that is multiple interviews. If you have 5 different interviews and they jive as to what happened, and they're all different newspapers, well, there's no way these people got together and said, "You know what, let's peddle this story. We'll all say this." And that means it's true, because they didn't all coordinate their stories. There's some guy in Canada down in New York. They didn't coordinate their stories.
And I assume there's a manifest. I assume there is a list somewhere of the people who were on that boat.
Absolutely. Now, saying that, and as you know from reading my book opens up with a fisherman outside New Jersey.
I wanted to ask you about. All right, you can tell the story now. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So he finds this bottle, and it says, it's the proverbial cork in the bottle with a note, and it says James Cork, of Berkshire, Glanmere.
Right.
And so, he basically, the letter says, "I'm on Titanic, ship going down, James Burke." And so everybody's like, wow, he threw this bottle off into eternity for all time to let people know what happened. It floated around the ocean. This guy picked it up.
And it was found only 2 months later. I was like, there's no way it could have gotten that far in 2 months, but okay.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so, but this story made it into all sorts of books as being true. And the truth is, there wasn't a James Burke of Glanmere Cork. He didn't exist. And so somebody just, was having a joke. They just did it, and so. But
I will say it's not a terrible joke. Well, okay, it's terrible because you're making light of the people who died, but it's pretty funny.
Yeah. But it also shows you how strong the mythology of Titanic is, where everything adheres to it.
All right, so there is this small budget film, I think, was shown in a couple theaters. It featured a couple of small actors named Leo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, and I think a few people may have seen it. It may have been put out on DVD at some point. Did that movie help or hurt what we understand about what happened both before the crash on the boat and then after the crash?
James Cameron sort of prided himself on being a Titanic buff. He went down to the wreck a bunch of times, and he really felt like he was keeping true to everything. No. I think it's great that they made it because it did bring it back. And there are things that are true, and of course, and really it's Walter Lord's book. I mean, it's really, it's a night to remember, that 112-page book from 1957. That's Titanic, throwing Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio on top of it, and put up, a sort of sappy love story on the very top deck. And so then you have that Titanic. So I think it was a good movie in terms. I mean, I like the movie. I think it had it brought forth a lot of things, but it was steeped in Titanic mythology because that's the lore, and that's what people want to hear mostly. The Titanic mythology is a great story, and why not? And so then you put a love story on top of it.
Is there anything in particular that you think we should know about what was true or not true in the movie, just so that, because so many of us can reference that movie as what, I mean, the movie became reality of the Titanic to a lot of people, maybe myself included. So are there things we should pay attention to and say, okay, this was true, this was not true, this was exaggerated, this was legit?
Well, okay, sure. First of all, all those great conversations everybody's having up on deck on Titanic, just chatting away. Well, that didn't happen because Titanic had about 24 boilers, and on April 14th, what it was, 12 p.m. or whatever, or 11:40, when she struck the iceberg. These are big reciprocating steam engines. So basically, she's going full bore. And, of course, Bruce Ismay and Captain Smith are like, let's set a record. Very true. And so they go bashing into the iceberg with, a full head of steam, literally. All these boilers are full up. Okay. The problem is Titanic stops. It's not going anywhere now. And she's all just chock full of steam. So you got to blow off those 24 boilers. And what you do is you blow it off through the funnels. And that creates a sound you can't imagine. Think of 100 locomotives blowing off steam in a train station. You couldn't hear yourself think. You could not communicate. No way on that deck. And Lightaller and others wrote about that and said they had to use sign language. They had to kind of, say, let's do this, let's do that with the boats. So during the panic, during the worst moments, you had the equivalent of a Nazi dive bomber screaming at you while you're trying to figure out how to get into a boat. So you couldn't talk. And so let's go to the other mythology the band played on. A woman in 1964 who was still around, who had been there, she said in an interview, she said, that's ridiculous. It was so cold. The strings would have broken. Also, the ship was at such an angle, they would have slipped right down. Also, you couldn't hear anything because of the steam blowing off. So what do we come to from that? So we know in the movie, the band played Near My God. Today, a lot of people talk about the band. So probably the band was somewhere playing, but, they weren't exactly amplified. And this is a massive ship. So maybe a few people heard this band, but when they started blowing out that steam, nobody heard anything. So that's one big difference between movie land and reality.
Gosh, how horrifying that must have been to, never mind be someone who went down with the ship, but someone who had to even just watch that. What a horrible scene that must have been.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, and we can talk about this some more. The people in the boats literally were sort of like an amphitheater where the 20 boats were surrounding the ship. And it was a brutally clear night, brutally cold, it was ungodly clear. And so everything was super etched. So you had this ship that kept its power right up to the last moment, was inverting like a skyscraper. And you were seeing this in real time, watching this and hearing it. And of course, one of the other mythology of the movie is things pretty much stayed together. And, at the end, they had one guy shot. But the truth is, most of those boats were away when the third class finally made it up, the 1,521 people. And they realized very quickly there was no way off that ship. And so pandemonium broke out. 12 people were shot and killed. And we know this from letters after the fact that were written. In the movie, you have one guy shoot one guy, and then he shoots himself and falls off the boat, the ship. But the truth is, it was every man for himself at that point, and all semblance of order had broken down. Because think of, just to give a real-time example, think of when the pandemic first hit, and they only had so many vaccines.
Yeah.
And everybody was trying to figure out how to get one.
Yeah.
That's what it was like on Titanic. Everybody wanted to get into a boat, but there just weren't near enough. And so, you realize very quickly you were going into that water.
Was the luxury on board as portrayed on the Titanic, and also the steerage portions of it was the luxury portions and the economy class portions, was that all pretty much portrayed as is?
Absolutely. It was a floating hotel. And, as you know from reading the book, I concentrate a lot on the wireless operators. And one of the things that Titanic offered was 24-hour wireless, which basically was their internet of the time. So if you were a first-class passenger, that's who sent these telegrams, you could send off your telegram to somebody in New York and say, hey, I'm having a great time in the middle of the ocean on Titanic. And also, they would download information using a 21st century term from shore stations like Nova Scotia. And then they had huge printing presses. And so Titanic had its own newspaper. So then in the morning, again, in your very ornate dining room, you could sit there, have your coffee croissants, and read about the Chicago Cubs. This was amazing to people in 1912. Just amazing. So not only was Titanic the most luxurious, it was the most advanced. It had the most advanced powerful wireless system of any ship on the ocean.
I do want to get to the 160 minutes, but just briefly, if you can, just sketch out for us why Titanic was built, whose idea it was.
It was actually, there was these wars going on, trying to go back and forth on the ocean liner trade. And so White Star built Titanic. They wanted to build the most luxurious, largest ship in the world. Bruce Ismay, who was president at the time of White Star, he believed that Titanic and her sister Olympic would set the bar, and that, you know, they could dominate then this trade. And of course, a lot of conspiracy theorists, J.P. Morgan actually owned White Star. A lot of conspiracy theorists say that Morgan sank the ship and all this stuff. It's just not true. So he can get money. But the point is, this was sort of their space shuttle of the time. It was to be the most advanced ship, the largest, set the tone of it luxury. And so it was sort of a deal breaker, if you will, of saying, we're just going to leapfrog ahead and nobody's going to catch us. And to go on Titanic will be this stellar, amazing experience for anybody who has the money. And it was incredibly expensive to go on Titanic. And it was really sort of a one-off. It was, this will be a once in a century event in terms of this, however long the steamline trade goes on, and nobody will ever catch us again. And of course, then they got Captain Smith, who had a 30-year career behind him. It was going to be the capstone of his career as a 30-year man. He was going to retire afterward. So this was the event in terms of the transatlantic passenger liner trade. There was to be none other that could ever touch them.
And what a stunning name for a ship, Titanic. Just maybe because of what we know about it, but where did they get the name from?
I think it was the god Titan was, I think, a Greek mythology, it is. It's such an evocative term that even today, when you say Titanic, you think of that ship, but it creates this image of this incredible mass, and of course, the photos in Belfast when it's being built are really just stunning, even still, because you see men standing by the props, and the props are gigantic, and that's also going back to the mythology. That's one reason the mythology began, because of course everybody said she was unsinkable, and that's really where a lot of Titanic mythology begins and ends.
What was life like in the West, in the UK, in New York City, when Titanic was going to make its maiden voyage, and how did Titanic symbolize the era that it was sailing in?
Well, we were on the far end of the Gilded Age, which is about 1865, and I would say the Gilded Age ended when Titanic sank. That's my personal opinion. So to 1912. So America had enjoyed incredible growth. The Gilded Age is fascinating because it was this amped up time of rapid, not only industrialization, but national markets. So credit was being extended. The modern economy was being established, and this money was untaxed. So places like New York City were just floating in money. And of course, again, if you've been watching the HBO Gilded Age, people, this new money class had come about that had never been around before. This super, they called the 400, the 400 richest families in America. For the first time, people were making money off the labor of others in a massive way. Before, you go work for Farmer John, and you get paid, or you bring your crops in and you'd sell them and you get paid. Well, with the advent of the railroads that they built during the Civil War, they can move all these goods to a national market. So now you were going to a city and you were selling your time. You're becoming a wage slave, which was very new. That hadn't happened before. And so this created enormous amounts of wealth for people who were, a very small class of people who were now this Gilded Age people. And the Gilded Age refers to, Mark Twain coined it, saying that it's a gold patina over rotted wood underneath. So into this, they built Titanic. And Titanic is literally a floating palace of the Gilded Age, of the very rich and famous, and all that money. And this is one reason it still fascinates us today, because it's really a snapshot of that time.
Let's get to the 160 minutes, 1140 to 220 between impact and foundering. Talk about what was going on in that messaging room, and who was nearby, and what messages were sent out, and who got them, and what was the reaction to them.
Yeah, so wireless telegraphy, again, is sort of like the early 80s of the personal computer. A lot of people didn't understand it. This new technology had its own language. It was a young man's game. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were the two operators. They don't work for White Star. They work for Marconi. So, this kind of viewed the way people view computer nerds today. It's kind of strange. So they keep to themselves. So when in 1140, after Titanic hits the iceberg, so 160 minutes refers to the amount of time they have before they're going to sink. And so in that time, they have to get a ship come to rescue them. Okay. Smith goes down to the wireless room and says, send out CQD, we've hit an iceberg, we're sinking.
Now,
so
they don't know it's going to be 160 minutes. I mean, they just know they've got to get a ship there as soon as possible. And there is this thought that the ship is unsinkable, but they're concerned, obviously.
Right. Architect Andrews, the designer, famously said, and we saw this in the movie to Captain Smith after he inspected the ship, she will sink, she will founder. And the reason he knew that is because they had watertight doors, and so 4 compartments could flood and Titanic could float. The problem with the watertight doors is the bulkheads only went up to the E deck. So think of yourself sitting in your living room and you've left the door open to your bedroom, to the outside and the windows, and a storm comes and all that water comes in and fills up your bedroom. While you're watching TV, it comes over the ceiling and floods into your living room. That's what happened to Titanic. Because it only went up to E deck, Titanic, and because she got 5 compartments ripped open, the math of that weight is pulling down the ship. Think of a canoe with a big anchor in it. And so all that water is rushing in and filling up each compartment. And yeah, the watertight bulkheads, the door slams shut, the electric door slams shut, but the water goes up and over, up and over. So that's how Andrews could say to Captain Smith, within 3 hours, she's going to be at the bottom of the ocean. So you're right. They didn't know they had 160 minutes, but they knew they were going down. So when Smith goes down to Jack Phillips and Harold Bride and says, send this out, we've hit an iceberg and we're sinking, they know they're on a time limit. And so wireless telegraphy is basically these signals shooting out. You don't know who's going to get them. You hope, in this, all right, so you can only go 500 miles during the day, but you can go 2,000 at night because it bounces off the ionosphere. And then it goes to shore stations like Newfoundland. And, amazingly, these signals bounced all the way to New York City. David Sarnoff, famously on top of Wanamaker's department store, sitting there, a little 20-something, and his headset goes off, and it's the Titanic saying she's going to sink. So this is the very infancy of this technology. And because of that, Captain Smith and others didn't really take it that seriously up until now when they're sinking. And so the race is on to get the signals out to any ships in the area who can turn around and come to them as quickly as possible.
What was the reaction? We know there was at least one ship relatively close, but the Carpathia. But just were there deaf ears to the messages, or did some hear this and say, "We wish we could get there, but we're too far," or just where did these messages land?
Yeah, a lot of the ships didn't quite believe it, but they did turn around. In the mythology of Titanic, she was out there all alone. She wasn't. There was lots of ships out there. Now, they were at varying distances. Carpathia was 50 miles away and didn't get the signal till later. She turns around, fires up her engines, puts out extra lookouts, gets a triage station set up, uncovers her lifeboats, and now starts coming right away for Titanic. Now, here's where it gets interesting. It's a ship called the Californian. Now, the Californian, there's a guy named Captain Lord, who's the old sort of imperious captain. And he doesn't really take wireless too seriously. He only has one little wireless operator. Now, Titanic hit an ice field. She didn't just hit an iceberg. She hit a whole field of ice. Okay. Lord hits the same field. He stops his ship, says, "That's it, I'm not going any further." And he lights up an extra light on the mast, and he's dead in the water. His wireless operator takes off his headset and is going to bed. Lord's going to go to bed. But his officers on the bridge see this really bright ship, very bright. And they say, "We think that's Titanic." And she looks really strange. Lord looks and says, "No, that's not Titanic. That is not Titanic. It's a Russian fishing trawler." But on his way down to his berth, he stops in the wireless room. The wireless operator is off now, and he says, "Hey, any ships in there?" He says, "Only Titanic." Well, Lord still says, "That's not Titanic." So this begins the strangest moment. Now, on Titanic, and this is where newspapers come in. On Titanic, all these people are on there, and they're putting them in boats, the 1%. And these boats hold about 75 people. And Captain Smith and Captain Lightoller say, see that light there? That's a ship. They're going to come to us and rescue us. Row toward that light. So they tell these people, go toward that light. That's how close is it? Well, that's the California. It's only 10 miles away. And they say, go toward that light. So all these people start rowing toward the light. And how do we know this? We know this through diaries. We know this through letters. We know this through newspaper articles. Everybody talks about seeing the light. So this was clearly there. And we know because Captain Smith and Captain Lightoller saw it. In fact, they're signaling them with a big white signal light at this point. So while these people are going toward this light, the Californian officers are getting very nervous because Titanic looks really strange. One side's way up out of the water. And so they call Lord back up again. They say, this is really strange. And he says, don't worry about it. It has nothing to do with us. Well, then Titanic starts shooting off rockets. Now, rockets at sea mean only one thing: come quickly, distress.
Yeah. Mucho problemos. Yeah, right.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what color they are, whatever. But Lord says, they call down to Lord, who's sleeping. They say, listen, we now see rockets. And Lord says, well, what color are they? And they go, well, they're white. And he's like, okay, well, let me know if anything changes. So, again, it doesn't matter what color they are. But Lord has decided, for whatever reason at this point, he's not moving. So these officers sit there watching this ship shooting off rockets, sinking, while people are rowing toward them. Now, on the far side is Captain Moore of the Mount Temple. And all right, so on the far side of the ice field, he has received the signal from Titanic. He's one of the very first to get it. And he immediately starts toward her. Okay. Now, he tells all his passengers, do not go up top. You're forbidden to go up top. But some passengers break the law or the rule, and they sneak outside, and they hit this bitter cold. And they look off, and they see a ship very close, sinking, shooting off rockets. And the crew sees it, and Moore sees it too. But he stopped his ship right at the edge of the ice field. and refuses to go in. And the crew, which is all ready to rescue, they've got their lifeboats uncovered and everything, they say, "You've got to do this." And he doesn't. And they even threaten mutiny. Meanwhile, all these passengers are staring in amazement at the Titanic that's sinking. And then Moore pulls back away from the ice field and starts to kind of move parallel to it. But he actually pulls away. So these two ships that are literally within 5-10 miles of Titanic, the captains do not go into that ice field.
And on a clear night, you can see pretty darn far, certainly 5-10 miles.
Oh, it was brilliantly clear. It was like, the stars were like brilliant blue color, pricks of light against this super dark black background. And the ocean was strangely calm.
Did they express regret after they realized what they'd witnessed and what happened?
All right. So what happened was, basically Moore, or Captain Lord, ends up afterward going back to New York when he did, and his crew and passengers all talked to the press, and he got pulled into the inquiry. Lord did, and they found him guilty of negligence, of not coming to the aid of Titanic. And he was disgraced.
Talk about the 700 people who made it onto lifeboats and where they wound up and how they got, it must have been quite a moment when they went from a lifeboat onto the Carpathia.
Yeah, well, so there's two things we want to talk about the 700 people. Titanic sinks, breaks apart, sinks. Now you have 1,500 people in the water.
It must have been. Well, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt you. Go ahead.
That's okay. So this is the darkest moment of Titanic. And so these people are all in the water. These are big boats. These aren't dinghies. They can hold 75 people. And most of them are half loaded because they didn't know what they were doing. It's the first class. They didn't load them up. So there's room for about 400 more people. People say, all right, so they're hearing these people in the water, and they aren't drowning or freezing to death because it's so cold. And they said the sound was like locusts on a summer night, or a ball game when a ball gets hit, or as long death moan all in the same pitch. And some people say, well, we should go back and get them. And other people say, no, we'll get swamped. You want to die too? And so only one boat went back of the 20 boats. And they picked up like 4 people. So this is a very shameful moment. People decided they would not go back and help these people. They just sat there and watched them drown. And so the survivors get picked up by Carpathia at about 3:20 a.m. after Titanic sank and taken back to New York. And when they hit New York, it's pandemonium. It's just absolute craziness because everybody wants to talk to them. And they get off, and reporters are literally throwing money at them to get their stories. And of course, the story that everybody does read is Harold Bride's story, who talks to the New York Times and gives an interview to the surviving wireless operator.
But the Carpathia, I mean, explain how they got the message. And by the way, whatever happened to the people who started rowing towards the boat that didn't come?
Okay. Well, first of all, the people that were rowing toward the boat would give up because the Californian was drifting.
Yeah.
And it was not coming into the ice field. So it was steadily moving, and so they could never get closer. And so, they finally go back to the Titanic because they didn't want to go too far from where Titanic was in the other boats. All right, so Carpathia, a guy named Captain Rostrom, he gets the message. Now he's sort of the guy who everybody, he's the exemplar captain. He does what we hope we all will do. He turns his ship around.
And about how far was he? Did he know?
He's 50 miles away.
50 miles, okay.
And so he takes his ship, turns it around, diverts all the steam to the engines, freezing out all his passengers, puts out extra lookouts, gets the boats ready, literally zigzags through icebergs the whole way, risking himself, his ship, makes it there an hour too late. He doesn't see anything. He thinks, my God, Titanic's gone. All the people are gone. He sees a green flare. One of the officers had a flare gun. Then he sees the 20 boats. He then starts to load people in. Most people are too cold. They can't climb up the ladder, the rope ladder he dropped. So they have to hoist them up into the ship. And it's mostly women because, the men mostly stay behind. And all these women also knew, Lawrence Beasley, who was a schoolmaster, said it was deathly quiet on Carpathia. Nobody could say anything. Shock, the knowledge that their husbands had died, all contributed to this. But in a strange occurrence, Harold Bride, who survived, the one wireless operator, he is horrible frostbite. He survived under a turned over lifeboat for a while. He ends up having to take over the wireless on Carpathia because their wireless operator drops down from exhaustion. And so then Carpathia becomes the most sought after ship in the world because everybody wants to know what happened to Titanic.
How eerie it must have been for all those people to be on those boats and suddenly Titanic is now gone and the people who are thrashing about are now quiet because they just couldn't survive for very long. And you're in the dead of night after watching this boat go down. Yeah.
And, on the return voyage to New York, they hit a bunch of storms, really violent storms. And people on Carpathia just freaked out because they thought, here we go again, And, when you read Story of the Survivors, a lot of them had tragic ends. A lot committed suicide. A lot can never get their lives back together again. Definitely what we know today as PTSD was definitely a factor then. They didn't recognize that even because shell shock was something from World War I, which was still, 5 years in the future. And so, a lot of them did suffer, from this experience, and but they suffered alone.
We certainly made the failings clear. But you say there's a success story in all this, and that's an important theme in your book, that Marconi and his wireless transmissions do illustrate a certain success, an aspect of success when it comes to Titanic.
Oh, yeah. You think about it. Without wireless, Titanic would have just disappeared. Times being what they are, we would today be like, the conspiracy theorists would be like, Martians took them, or something like that. Mostly, though, ships disappeared. They just didn't know. They just sank. So we knew what happened to the Titanic. It was a real-time event, which was a first. And then 700 people were rescued. And that's because Jack Phillips and Harold Bride stayed at their post all the way up until Titanic was literally going down into the water. And that is the heroism that we all hope for, or Captain Rostrum, who came with Carpathia dodging icebergs. These are the people we hold up and go, wow, this is the human ideal. Unfortunately, the Captain Lords and the Captain Moores are reality as well.
I'm not sure if you keep a close eye on the future and where the Titanic wreckage is now, but there is talk that one day the effects of the ocean could essentially dissolve it into the rest of the ocean, and one day it'll be gone forever. If you could go down there right now, what would you look for first? What would you be most interested to see?
Well, because I started my research with the wireless room, and interestingly enough, the wireless room is still there intact, and there is a expedition being planned to try and bring the wireless room up. And because they think there might be something still in the coils of those old receivers and things like that. And of course, it's hit a roadblock because it is considered a grave site. So I don't know if they ever will bring it. But that's what I would be interested in. Because really, when you think about it, those two guys tapping away through the night, trying to get any help they could, were really sort of the best of people. Because, Captain Smith went to them at about 2:10. Titanic sank at 2:20 and said, men, you're all done. It's every man for himself. You can leave your post. And they stayed there. They stayed there until the dynamos stopped and they had no power, trying just to get somebody to come. So, I would like to think that, there is some final message in that old wireless room, and probably would have been just what they were sending out, which is, will you come help us?
Hmm. What did you learn about human nature when you think about quotes like, this ship can't sink? No way. What does it tell you that people refuse to believe that the facts of our environment, the facts of the physical structures that we all live in and that we all need to survive, at least in our way of life? What does it tell you that, what does that quote say to you about human nature?
Um, you know, hubris is something you have to be really careful with, because, here they thought they had conquered science, nature, they created this ship that was unsinkable. And that, in just the very first voyage, in a nanosecond, that all turned around, where literally the entire ship, all that technology, all came to depend on two little 20-somethings who were sitting in a little shack sending out these messages. Everybody's life depended on these two guys all of a sudden, and this very nascent technology. So, Marconi was not a real scientist. He was more of a businessman. And so, it's just by luck that he decided, I'm going to put these wireless sets on all these ships. And Titanic was one of them. Easily, Titanic could not have had a set, or it could have had a substandard one, or they even had a problem before they hit this thing. So I think, what you come down to is, beware of your own hubris. Beware of saying, we've done it. And we can all relate to this now, I think, of the pandemic, which is that, we're finished with that. We moved on. Remember, the postman always rings twice.
What safety changes were made in the ship industry once the Titanic disaster happens?
Well, obviously, lifeboats. You had that, and then have lifeboats for everybody on board.
That seems reasonable.
Yeah, and then the other one was the wireless sets had to be on all the ships, and also the wireless communication between the bridge and the wireless room was clearly established, and where these had to be acted on. In Titanic, we didn't talk about this, but they had 10, 12 ice warnings. But then they would float up, they'd stick them on a bulletin board. Captain Smith would put one in his pocket, walk around with it, give it to Bruce Ismay at dinner. He'd read it, give it back to him. It was regarded as sort of a gadget, an addendum to the great knowledge of Captain Smith and his 30 years at sea. It was not regarded as a critical tool to navigate through the seas and for safety. After that, it was known that this was preeminent. This technology would take preeminence over the captain, because you know what? You can tell where an iceberg is. You should slow down. If he had taken those ice warnings seriously, he would have backed way off, gone a little further south, changed his course, dropped down the speed. But it was regarded as a sort of a gadget, it's almost a toy at that time.
Oftentimes I have to ask authors, what are you planning on writing next? But in this case, we already know. Greed in the Gilded Age, the brilliant con of Cassie Chadwick. Tell us about that story. I think it's coming out, or maybe it just came out, right?
Yeah, it just came out about 3 to 4 weeks ago. So that's a story that really ties into our time. I just finished watching Inventing Anna, Netflix
My wife and I are watching that too.
Yeah, it's a great series. And The Gilded Age is also great. So the brilliant kind of Cassie Chadwick concerns a woman. This mirrors Inventing Anna so strangely. In 1900, she said she was the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie. She had no education. She was a drifter. She had managed to bamboozle a very rich doctor and marrying her in Cincinnati. She lived on what's called Millionaire's Row. And then she created this elaborate con where she said she was the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie. And she was very smart. She understood how, money was lent at this time. And so she would go into banks and drop trust agreements on these bankers who would see them and say, wow, we're going to get the Carnegie millions. And they gave her millions of dollars without signing any documents. And this is a time when you got a loan, you gave a kickback to the bank. And so she'd give them a kickback and she went on her way. So she borrowed the equivalent of, say, $60 million today and lived this life of luxury, all while saying she was the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie. When they finally caught up to her, it became the trial of the century where Carnegie actually got pulled into the courtroom.
Two more questions. One is, how do you figure out what to write next? You've written 20 books on really a nice array, a different array of things, I guess all from, maybe the early part of the 20th century. But
yeah.
What stories do you discover and why do you say, this one should be a book?
It's a lot of times I'm reading another book and I'll stumble onto a little piece that the author sort of blew over. And I'm like, wait a minute. And so, like, say, take Forging a President, How the Wild West Created Teddy Roosevelt. I was reading biographies, of him. And, there was this part where his wife and mother died on the same day in 1883. And he went west for 3 years to the Badlands and was not going to come back. And so the thought was, what happened out there? Because when he came back, he was radically different. And so then after a little research, I found out, wow, this made Teddy Roosevelt, what this life he led out there. This gave us the barrel-chested Teddy Roosevelt. So I usually kind of find something, that, again, it's referenced, or I'll read a newspaper article and I bet, well, that's a fascinating story, or that's a very interesting person. And it has to sort of resonate for me. I do like the early 20th century a lot, American history. So usually it's in that wheelhouse somewhere. And then, you go, oh, and then you write a proposal, for the publisher. The difference between narrative nonfiction and fiction is that books are bought on proposals. They aren't bought on manuscripts. So, if I say, hey, I've got this great story on Titanic, this angle, and I write that proposal, then they're going to give me a contract on that. And so then that's the final, okay, I'll write that, and believe me, a lot of proposals don't go anywhere.
You've had them rejected, of course, I guess.
Oh,
right?
my God.
Yeah. How long does it take you? A couple years to do a book?
Yeah. I mean,
it's your only job. So
yeah, the research is probably the hardest part for me is getting together, all the books, and all the materials. And then at a certain point, I'm like, well, I know enough. And so I sort of just turn on the blender and write the story. And everything, all my work is footnoted. And that's very important to me because I want people to be able to go back and see where I got this information, because they think, how's he going to back this up? Well, here's the sources, go read the sources for yourself.
And so it's a couple years for you, or about how long does it take?
Yeah, generally speaking, yes. Because of the pandemic, I had a bunch of contracts before. Now the books have been kind of coming out one on top of each other, but that's just because they all got jammed up.
Last question. Is it possible to think of a common thread between all 20 of your books beyond just the time period? Or I'm just asking, I guess they say all books are autobiographical in a certain way, right?
Yeah. I would say probably there's probably a real American theme in them where people are overcoming adversity and remaking themselves a lot of times. I think that's what, I'm always fascinated with is people being able to fail mightily and then go back and recreate themselves or come out of it or triumph over adversity. And that's a very Horatio Alger American theme, rags to riches sort of thing. And I think probably most of my books somewhere touch on that, be it Wilbur Wright and, Wright Brothers' Wrong Story, or Teddy Roosevelt, or even Edith Wilson, It's all people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, and then how do they handle that? And so that makes it very personal. I think when you read my books, you are engaged personally, because that's the only way I can write them.
William Hazelgrove, the author of 160 Minutes, The Race to Save the RMS Titanic. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Check out the book. Check out his website, williamhazelgrove.com. His Twitter feed is @RocketMan46. Also, check out his latest book, Greed in the Gilded Age, which was published last month. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @AxelBankHistory. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.